Last year in January, talking about voting age, she did very well then, and I've no doubt she's going to do very well now. Theresa.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great privilege to be back again before you. And as with before, I'm going to stick with some flashing pictures, if that's all right. It's very early in the morning. What I want to take you through are just some of the international experiences of immigrant voting and some of the issues that can come up when we talk about people with voting rights abroad. So starting off, I just want to alert you to the fact that voting rights can be covered by all of these different terms: out of country voting, absentee voting, voting rights for immigrants, and very often these terms are actually used interchangeably. Okay, is it all right? In the literature, but they all effectively mean the same thing, which is giving rights to participate in elections to citizens resident abroad for a short or a longer period of time. In terms of external voting rights around the world, well, it's a very mixed and variable picture. What we see is that a majority of countries actually extend voting rights to their citizens abroad, and we have a report from 2007 from the IDEA which tells us that 115 countries have given voting rights in some shape or form to their citizens at particular types of elections. And what you can see from this table here is that this is broadly spread across the world, with quite a considerable concentration of countries in Europe actually extending voting rights to their citizens living abroad. And just to put it another way, I suppose we would say that there are just 70 countries worldwide that don't extend voting rights to their citizens abroad in some shape or form. And I've this particular map here is taken from that report, and it gives you a kind of a better graphical expression of the kind of, if you want, the electoral elections at which people can vote, and then just the regions of the world that have actually extended these voting rights. Just to give you an example of countries that do not extend widespread voting rights, I just hit the I section of the report there. So we see India, Israel, and Ireland are ones that have quite limited voting rights for citizens abroad. In terms of this discussion, the first thing that comes through in all of the research reports that have been written is that countries that are interested in extending voting rights to citizens abroad should begin with a broad consultative process. So I think from that point of view, we can see ourselves as having been engaged on that particular journey. But there are a number of issues that it's recommended that you consider in this particular discussion. The first thing is, are voting rights going to be extended to all citizens abroad or to certain categories or groups of people? Will citizens be able to vote in all elections or just some elections? And then the third part, more practical element, is how are you going to facilitate citizens voting abroad? What particular mechanisms or tools are going to be put in place to facilitate citizens abroad exercising their franchise? So if we start with the first of these, in terms of who is entitled to vote or to which citizens, there are a whole range of different options here. The first thing is you may find there are group restrictions, so we may start off and we find voting rights will be extended to the military who are working abroad, or people on police missions. In other countries, the diplomatic service of that particular country, or civil servants who are working abroad at international organisations on specific tours of duty may be included in the franchise. And other countries, and this is particularly the case in geography, they extend, in Africa, geography is the basis of the citizens abroad voting rights, and countries that are bordering the home state, citizens living in those countries for practical reasons do get to have voting rights, but not other citizens. Countries may also opt for a wider understanding or interpretation of citizen abroad voting rights, and it may be extended to all citizens abroad. But we'll go into the next round of restrictions, which is that there may be some time limits imposed on the citizens who are living abroad. So a country may decide to extend voting rights to citizens, but those voting rights may expire. They may actually run out after a particular period of time. And what we have here is, again, just another table from the IDEA, and it's giving us some examples of voting rights that expire after a particular period of time. Just to pick countries that are close to us here at home, in the UK, voting rights expire after 15 years, and in Germany, they expire after 25 years. It's also important to remember that voting rights can actually be maximum or minimum. So some countries may require you to be outside of the country for a certain period of time before you acquire your voting rights. And in other cases, you may actually lose your voting rights if you have spent more than a set period of time outside of the country. So the time restrictions or the time limits may actually work in both directions. And this is something to keep in mind. In terms of the next question, can citizens vote in some or all elections? And again, the picture here is actually quite mixed. You find that some countries extend the voting right for all elections, whereas other countries will restrict it to certain categories of elections. The international experience is that where voting rights are extended, they tend to be extended most frequently for parliamentary or presidential elections. And that those are the ones that are included, or where voting rights for citizens are included. We just point to some examples from this particular table here. I realise they're very, very small. This is from the Council of Europe. We'll just point to Portugal, for example, which is a semi-presidential system, a little bit like Ireland, extends voting rights for presidential, parliamentary and referendums. Germany, on the other hand, only extends voting rights to its citizens abroad for parliamentary elections, but that has to be kind of interpreted in the context that they don't have referendums there, and of course their president is appointed. So when we're looking at this table, it's not just a straightforward case that voting rights are restricted to certain categories of elections. We also have to remember that some of these countries don't have all elections. So we need to keep that in mind when we're interpreting the data as well. This is, again, just another table to reinforce the point. There are 14 countries which extend voting rights to citizens in just presidential elections. And what you'll see from the category of countries that we've highlighted here is most of these tend to actually be what we call presidential systems. So you have a president that is elected with executive powers, quite similar to, for example, the United States or France. The third question which arises is, how do citizens vote when they are abroad? So this is getting into the kind of more technical, how do you actually go about casting your vote? And there are four broad options or four broad categories that are used when citizens are voting abroad. Many countries actually combine these, so it's not the case that you would opt for just one of these methods over another. Countries can actually offer 2 or 3 of these particular options. So we have postal voting, proxy voting, e-voting, and in-person voting. So when we start with postal voting, because this is actually the most common one, and in many instances we're familiar with postal voting because it's available to citizens within the country. Certain categories of citizens are able to avail of a postal vote at elections in Ireland in any case. Just briefly, the advantages of postal voting: it's relatively convenient for voters. They may vote at a time of their choosing. So it, if you want, reduces the burden on voters. Importantly, it guarantees the secrecy of the ballot. So the voter casts their own ballot, and it is returned directly without any compromising, or hopefully no compromising of the ballot. And in a kind of an overall context, postal voting is relatively low cost and easy to operate. The problems of postal voting is that not all postal systems are equally reliable. And just to kind of put this into context, elections can come up unexpectedly, and they have to be organised in a short space of time. But even when an election is not unexpected, actually the time frame is quite narrow, because you have to allow candidates to register. Ballot papers there's a close for nomination from all candidates, which will occur at a particular point in time, and the election is usually 3-4 weeks out from that particular date. So even when you're planning for an election, actually the time frame itself can be quite narrow for getting ballots printed, distributed across the world, and also then returned in time to be counted in their constituencies at home. So the actual timing of elections is quite important, or is a limiting limitation, if you want, in relation to the postal system. So that is, if you want, the kind of significant limitation of the postal voting. If we move on to proxy voting, what proxy voting really refers to is the idea that you nominate somebody to cast your ballot on your behalf. So your name is included in the register in your home country, and as part of your external vote, you nominate somebody else to go to your polling station and cast your ballot on your behalf. So you can choose the person who goes and casts the ballot on your behalf. The difficulty, or sorry, we'll start with the advantage of this particular option is that it's cheap. And it's logistically relatively easy to organise because the other person is nominated in advance, they're in the country, they're in the constituency, they can go to the polling station with relative ease. The major drawback of proxy voting, though, is that the secrecy of the ballot is effectively compromised because you are nominating somebody else to cast on your behalf. So your ballot is no longer secret. Proxy voting is offered in a number of countries, usually in a combination, possibly with postal voting being offered as well. It's available in the UK and also in Belgium. E-voting is not really used very much at the moment, but we put it in here because, of course, we anticipate that electronic voting is going to become a much more significant option in terms of both domestic voting and out of country voting. There have been a number of trials in places like France and the UK, but actually Estonia is the country which is probably at the most advanced level of development in terms of trialling e-voting systems. The systems themselves, the difficulties with them, there's always a concern with regard to security. Voters aren't always confident that the security of their ballot is maintained, and voter confidence in the system can be low. And if you want, this is the kind of major stumbling block to the use of e-voting in future years. E-voting, well, it's voting by fax, actually, if you want, is used in New Zealand for citizens resident abroad. So it is used in some instances when people are casting their votes abroad. It's more likely in the future as we overcome these hurdles, and the major reason being that it's very efficient and, of course, it's low cost. So it offers the opportunity to maintain the secrecy of the ballot, and it overcomes some of the limitations that we would associate with postal voting. And then finally, in-person voting, and I think you're going to hear a little bit about this evening. This is voting where voters actually attend embassies, diplomatic missions, consular offices around the world. So you vote in person at an international polling station. So there's a range of countries that offer this, including the United States, and you'll hear, if you want to, a lot more about that this evening. The great advantage of voting at embassies or consular offices, again, is that the secrecy of the ballot is ensured. From the point of view of administering elections, it's very important because it means that the country of origin has a lot of control over the circumstances in which the ballot is actually cast. So they can give additional reassurances to voter with regard to the voting environment. The difficulty with voting abroad or voting in embassies is, the first thing is that not all countries have an extensive diplomatic network all over the world. And that poses a significant problem for citizens because it may then either disenfranchise them because there is no embassy close by, or for citizens living abroad, it may place an excessive burden on them to travel long distances to attend their embassy. So for countries with an extensive diplomatic mission or an extensive network of diplomatic missions across the world, it works very well, but it has limitations, if you want, in other circumstances. And what has occurred in a lot of cases where in-person voting is offered is it's usually combined also with a postal vote for citizens as well. So if you cannot, you can opt for one or the other. Just the last set of things that I want to kind of draw your attention to, and these are just some practical considerations to keep in mind in your discussions today. The first thing is that one of the, if you want, the problems that you have when you extend voting rights to citizens living abroad is you are, if you want, ceding some of the control and organisational frameworks and structures we have around the vote to other countries. So governments cannot guarantee that the same voting environment will be available to voters all over the world. And that's especially the case where citizens may be voting in countries that don't have the same democratic traditions and the same kind of guarantees of security aren't there. An issue that comes up from time to time, and it's related to this idea, is that there are concerns about fraud when it comes to out-of-country or absentee voting. And again, a lot of the reasons behind this is because the voting takes place away from the electoral management agency. It's also usually difficult to observe voting, out-of-country voting. It's not possible for international observers or even domestic observers to observe the voting. And again, those layers of reassurances that are there for in-country voting aren't always present for out-of-country voting. It's also true that out-of-country voting incurs an additional cost, and the most recent report we have shows that in-country voting has a cost per vote or per voter of about $1 to $2. But when it comes to out-of-country or external voting, that cost raises to anywhere between $5 and $20, depending on the method that is offered, the size of the international voting population, and whether a combination of voting methods are offered. And then the last thing to kind of keep in mind is that administration burdens are significantly greater when it comes to external voting, because citizens have to be registered in their own constituencies, depending on the type of election that is involved. But if citizens are being registered for parliamentary elections, for example, they must be registered in their own constituencies. They must receive the ballot from their own constituency, and that ballot must be returned to their home constituency so that it can be included in the counting in that process. So under PRS-TV, for example, at Dáil elections, there would be a particular administrative burden. That would certainly be lesser at a presidential election, because you wouldn't have the same requirement with regard to constituencies. But it's important to remember that citizens would need to be registered in particular categories. They would need to receive the correct ballots. Those would need to be returned and counted in the correct order. So there are additional layers of complexity that are put in here, particularly when you kind of think about the electoral systems and the types of constituencies that might be at play. So these are some practical considerations, if you want, and it's recommended that these are kept in mind in the discussions that take place with regard to extending voting rights. So to conclude, we kind of come back to the central question: should voting rights be extended for Irish citizens living outside of the Republic of Ireland? And in answering yes to this, then we can draw on the international experiences and of other countries, and we need to look at any restrictions which might be imposed on those particular voting rights, and what modes we might use for extending those particular voting rights. So thank you very much, and I wish you every success in your deliberations.